Welcome to a special episode of r/JustNoHOA, where we read an entire JustNoHOA saga in one video. If you enjoy my content, please don't forget to subscribe to join our awesome community. And now let's dive right into the stories. Just so you know, we have already read part 1 and 2 in a previous video, so if you already know them, please skip ahead to 11 minutes. The first one is titled FHOA, Recalled and Removed Our Tyrannical HOA Board. Part 1, Prelude. This is the account of how we fought and ultimately prevailed in our long-running battle with an out-of-control HOA board. I've been meaning to post this here for a while, but it was such an ordeal trying to condensing it into one post that I will have to break the timeline into several posts to cover it all, and I will still be leaving out a good 50% of what went on. Part 1. So what does it mean when it says that a house is in an HOA? We naively asked the real estate agent at the newly built community that we were looking at back in 1998 in Arizona. My wife and I had both grown up in northern New Jersey, not far from New York City. This is an old section of an old state that has already been pretty well built up, and since the houses are all largely pre-1980s, there really are not any HOAs there. We also lived in New York, about an hour out of New York City, and since this was all farm country, there were not any HOAs there at the time either. Neither of us had ever heard of such a thing. The agent quickly glossed over it, basically selling us on how great HOAs are for property values and how they made sure that all of the houses were well maintained. Previously, where we lived in New Jersey, you would occasionally come across that one house in a neighborhood that stood out like a sore thumb. Foot-high weeds, junk cars, trash everywhere, broken windows, and typically a hand-scrawled sign hanging on the front of the house, going off on either a religious rant or seething about whoever happened to be the president at the time. We certainly were not going to be one of those people, and if living in an HOA prevented that, then hey, maybe it won't be all that bad after all. Well, it did not take too long after moving in to see where living in an HOA could begin to become a problem when we received a violation notice for putting our garbage cans out 30 minutes too early. Pickup was on Monday, so the cans could not go out before noon on Sunday. While the board did not do anything illegal during the time that we lived there, we soon found out that they were obsessed with enforcing the rules to the very letter. To illustrate how fixated with it they were several years later, I received another violation letter, this time for putting our garbage cans out 2 minutes too early. In this instance, I was heading out the door and looking at the clock, I saw that it was 11:55 AM. I figured, close enough. By the time that I get outside, unlock the gate and get the cans out to the curb, it should be 11:57 or 11:58. 2 days later was when I received the violation letter, so apparently they had someone literally patrolling the neighborhood at exactly noon looking for violators. They also had very specific landscaping rules that they also fanatically enforced as well. There was a list of approved and disallowed plantings and exactly how many of each that you could have and how many you must have. If one died, you had to replace it with one from the approved list. If something sprouted on its own, that meant that you now had one too many and one had to go. One day, some new people moved in, and apparently never having lived in an HOA before, they must not have read the rules too closely because they extensively landscaped the front yard without getting approval. It looked great when they were done. They had the nicest looking front yard in the whole development. The problem was that they put in plants on the disallowed list and far too many plants overall. The HOA made them take it all out, even though they had substantially improved the appearance of their property and had enhanced the property value. The board's official policy of "the rules are the rules" meant that they did not have much other option, illustrating that it is less about property values and more about conformity, control, and punishing violators. Annoyed about the whole thing, they took a scorched earth response in protest and ripped literally every single plant out of the yard. The one tree that was left had every branch cut off. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Well, now they were in trouble for not having enough plants in their yard, and they begrudgingly had to put in the bare minimum and moved away shortly thereafter. We lived there for 8 years. The house was your typical cheaply built new build that are all too common in Arizona since they lowered the building codes in the late 80s. Wanting something nicer and specifically better built, we started looking for another house. The first thing that we told our agent was, no HOAs. After living in one for 8 years, we had our fill of them. If only we had stuck to our guns, we could have avoided a ton of aggravation. If you have watched until here, please don't forget to post some star emojis in the comments and also like the video if you want to support me. Every like and every comment helps me tremendously, thank you very much. And the next one is part 2 of the story that we have started in yesterday's video. It is titled FHOA, Recalled and Removed Our Tyrannical HOA Board Part 2, the supposedly good HOA. We started looking and we came across a house that we really liked. The issue was of course that it was in an HOA, but the agent assured us that this was a good one, not at all like the last one that we lived in, and he had a point. This development was built in the early 80s, so the CC&Rs were rather condensed. The use restrictions were all of 2 pages and were essentially the same as the city municipal blight codes. Of course, there was the usual, garbage cans must be stored out of sight, no livestock, etc. But nothing really objectionable. Little did we know that in previous years the entire board had to be removed and that there had been 2 earlier lawsuits as well, all of which we were unaware of. So we bought it, and honestly for the better part of 8 years it looked like the agent was right after all. This was the rare benign HOA. There were no amenities, very little common area, just a few end caps, and association fees were low, $38 a month. It made it easy to forget that you were actually living in an HOA. Subsequently, homeowner apathy was rampant. There were a fair number of rental units and snowbirds, both of which were totally checked out and uninvolved. Nobody ever went to any of the HOA meetings or paid any attention to what was going on, myself included, which opened the door to the issues that would later come. Unbeknownst to us, all the board was slowly being taken over by a guy who was the living embodiment of Barney Fife from the old Andy Griffith show. It's the classic story, older guy, nothing better to do, busybody control freak, gets on the board and everybody watch out now. There's a new sheriff in town, who's going to clean this place up? Hilarity, or is it headaches, follow. He initially got on the board because he ran uncontested and seemed to think that he was appointed dictator of the community. So Mac5, as I will refer to him from here on out, is such an unpleasant, disagreeable a-hole to deal with that one by one as board members' terms came up, they simply did not run again because they had enough dealing with him. This allowed him to replace them with his hand-picked puppets who just did whatever he told them to. Once he had full control of the board, Mac5 went wild. They started fining people for things that were not actually prohibited, refused to grant anyone a hearing with the board, and simply ignored the bylaws and state law regarding the fine process. The typical scenario went like this. They would send out a violation letter. If you did not do what they wanted within a week, the fines would start rolling in on a weekly basis, increasing in dollar amount each time with veiled threats of foreclosure soon to follow, even though you cannot foreclose for unpaid fines in Arizona. Most people were just getting intimidated and folded. When they tried fining us for things that are not in the CC&Rs, I finally had enough and called them out on it and let everyone else know what was going on. Their response was to carpet bomb the community with fines, especially the people that they did not like, while their friends were exempt. The more fines that they sent out, the more people complained. The more people complained, the more fines they sent out. In 8 months, they issued 5 times the number of fines that had been issued for the previous 3 years combined. The infamous Labor Day lambasting. As was par for the course, they scheduled the next meeting with minimal notice, 16 hours, and on a holiday in the hopes that no one would show up. To their surprise, a good 40 homeowners appeared, intent on letting the board know just what they thought of their latest antics. At the end of the meeting, each homeowner had 2 minutes to address the board. It quickly degenerated into 40 minutes of one homeowner after the other excoriating the board relentlessly. They really had no defense, and the meeting wrapped up with a former board member advising them that if they were unclear as to their duties, that perhaps they should schedule a consultation with the HOA attorney, which they did. The attorney had to spend 4 hours explaining the CC&Rs, bylaws and state law to them because they were incapable of figuring them out for themselves, and ultimately they had to reverse all of the outstanding fines that they had sent out since they were not valid. This was all a bit of a setback for Mac 5, and for a few months things were pretty quiet. No new fines were coming out, and we all figured that we had reined them in. Little did we know that Mac 5 had other plans. Recalled and removed our tyrannical HOA board Part 3. Emperor Mac 5 strikes back. So, after a few months of relative peace, the board was added again. Here is a highly abbreviated recap of their reign of terror. One of the owners rents out the property, and as the latest tenant just moved out, she was doing some repairs and maintenance. The garage door and door leading into the house were open as workers were going in and out. One of the board members, clipboard in hand, just walked into the house unannounced and then started dictating to the owner all of the things that they wanted done inside and out.
You will have to remove that tree. We don't like that kind. We will provide you with a list of what we like. In fact, we really don't like the way your yard is landscaped at all. We want you to redo the whole yard. And here's what we want you to do inside.
They are lucky the owner did not tell them to shove their clipboard up their ass. One of the other owners was having landscaping done in her backyard. The board demanded access to her yard so that they could see what she was doing, which they have no authority to do. She is originally from New York City and does not put up with any crap, and told them to go F off. Her property backs up to the common area, and later on she caught them standing at her back wall looking over into her yard. The north side common area is on a very busy street. This stretch had an abundance of well-established trees that had been there for over 30 years that acted as a natural sound barrier and privacy wall. Well, in a stroke of brilliance to save money, the board decided to turn all of the water off for the summer, which is regularly 100+ degrees here in Arizona. None too surprisingly, probably 60% of the trees died. So now they say,
we have to cut down the dead trees.
But not only that, they decide to go one step further. The residents whose property backs up there had gotten into it with the board for shutting off the water in the first place, so as retaliation, they not only had the dead trees cut down, but every live tree that was opposite the backyards of the homeowners that complained. So many homeowners protested about the trees being cut down that they begrudgingly planted a handful of new trees. Well, 6 months later, they got mad at certain residents again, and as punishment they went through and cut down every one of the new trees that they had just planted. Of course, the homeowners whose property backs up here again complained vigorously. A year and a half later, they still had not planted any new trees, given the residents any idea if or when they planned on putting in any new trees, and could not or would not give any kind of coherent explanation as to why they cut down the newly planted trees and live trees to begin with. Mac 5 and his minions also were not all that fond of what they considered
non-whites
either.
This is what happens when those people move into a community.
I also personally overheard him making anti-Semitic comments after one of the meetings directed at a friend of ours. Once after one of the meetings, my wife heard Mac 5 fuming to the other board members.
These people are going to have to learn to do as I say. Anyone who does not follow my rules and do what I tell them to do when I tell them to do it will be punished.
They started hiring a uniformed police officer at $180, more wasted money, to attend the meetings specifically to throw anyone out who dared to ask a question that they did not like. Someone would ask a question that they could not or would not answer, and their response would be,
we are not going to answer that at the current time.
Or they would give a complete non-answer and then want to move on. Here is a typical exchange. Homeowner would ask a question that they did not like. Board would refuse to answer or give a non-answer and then say,
"We're going to move on."
Homeowner, "But you did not answer the question." Board,
"One more word out of you and we will have the officer throw you out."
A friend of ours was the only person actually ever thrown out because her response was, "So you either cannot or will not answer the question. Which is it?" The president blew up shouting,
"That's it, you're out. Officer, get her out of here now. Out, get out now."
Our friend and the cop were laughing as he led her away. He followed them out into the hallway, yelling the whole time. That was the beginning of the end for them, people who had shown up to the meeting saying that they wanted to see for themselves if things were as bad as we were saying they were shaking their heads and looking around in disbelief. And then there was the harassment, vandalization and defamation that was directed towards myself and my wife that started after the infamous Labor Day meeting. It was well known that I was the one that alerted the neighborhood as to what was going on, so now I was labeled the neighborhood troublemaker. Frequently, someone would steal my garbage cans and take them 4 blocks away and throw them into a busy street. The president of the HOA's kid wailed a big rock at my house. I heard it hit and had 2 witnesses and I had to file a police report. The security lights on the side of my property were damaged. Someone, take a guess who, filed an anonymous complaint with the city saying that my property had dead trees and an accumulation of garbage violating the city codes for blight. Of course, none of this was true and the city inspector came by and promptly closed the case as my property was not in violation of any city codes or any of the community CC&Rs, which is why they could not fine me for anything, which frustrated them to no end. And then there were the monthly newsletters where we were specifically singled out month after month. They took things out of context, misrepresented others or just flat out fabricated complete lies. The highlight of all of this bullcrap came at the annual meeting where I got to be the feature of a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation where they went so far as to take my actual emails, chop them up and piece them together to try to make it look as if I said things that I never did. I would have liked to see him try to defend that one in court. They tried to portray us as the neighborhood crackpot troublemakers who just don't want to follow the rules. We were single-handedly bringing the whole community down, turning it into a ghetto, driving the property values down, etc. And this went on for a full 20 minutes. Virtually everything that was presented was willfully distorted and taken out of context. At one point I had enough and pointed out that he had misrepresented what I actually said by editing my emails, and they threatened to have the cop that they hired for the occasion, who would be a regular attendee from this point on, throw me out. It was difficult to keep from going off on them, but I had to because I was looking at the long game, which was to get them removed. Getting into a big argument with them and getting thrown out would have been counterproductive to that end because there were still a lot of people who really did not know the full story. After they had their say, I nailed them to the wall because I had concrete proof of them falsifying meeting minutes and election results and handed out copies to everyone in attendance, which laid the groundwork for their eventual downfall. Guys, what are you thinking so far about this FHOA story? In my opinion, at least so far, this is one of the best HOA stories we have read. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next one is part 4 of the story, titled Emperor Mc5's New Rules to Live By. After I revealed that the board had been falsifying meeting minutes and election results combined with their behavior at the annual meeting, their reputation in the community was at an all-time low, so for a few months once again, things were relatively quiet. A few months later, we all received a rather large package in the mail from Star Management Company. Since the HOA only has 99 houses and very little common area, we had been self-managed, so none of us knew who Star Management was. Well, it appeared that the HOA had decided to hire a management company without telling anyone. After talking about the new management company, there followed several pages of new architectural guidelines. When built, the only color option was white. Over the years, this had been expanded to include various shades of tan and brown, but Mac 5 was now paring back the choices with the goal of eventually returning to only white. And then what followed was 15 pages of newly created use restriction after use restriction after use restriction. The new rules that they had just made up micromanaged every single aspect of your property, front, back, what you can have inside your garage, how long you can leave your garage door open, and they were trying to dictate the inside of the house too. Essentially, these are the CC&Rs that our very own version of Barney 5 wishes he had at his disposal, but since they did not exist, he just created them up entirely out of thin air. Needless to say, several of us were on the phone to an attorney the very next day. The two attorneys that reviewed the documents were literally laughing and shaking their heads as they read it. They stated that either they had just manufactured this themselves, or if they paid someone for this, they need to ask for their money back. The guidelines were so vague and flexible that it gave the board the ability to fine anyone for anything at any time that they wanted to at their discretion. The interpretations could vary from year to year and member to member, depending on the whims of the then current board, leaving the homeowners in the dark as to whether they were in violation of any given rule, until they start receiving violation letters. And then, who knows, maybe the next board will interpret it differently. Fully 90% of the houses were in violation of something under the new rules. Most houses had multiple violations. Many of the rules were specifically crafted to target certain people in the community that they did not like. There were at least 3 rules that were created just for me. As written and ratified in our attorney's opinion, if they actually attempted to enforce most of this, they would have been opening themselves up for repeated lawsuits. In addition, the management company was not even going to be handling the billing. They were specifically hired by the board for the purpose of enforcing their new rules and assessing fines, because they did not have the guts to face the homeowners themselves. We all knew that they were going to be providing them with a hit list of the people that they wanted to go after, while their friends and neighbors would remain exempt because that was consistent with their previous track record and there was nothing to indicate that this would change. Word of what they had done spread like wildfire. I had furious people stopping me in the street, emailing, calling, showing up at the front door, all saying similar things. Who the hell do these people think they are? And what can we do about it? If these were the rules that were in effect when I looked at this house, I never would have bought it. I would have told the agent to keep looking. I won't live under this bullcrap. I will move first. An open meeting was scheduled a few weeks out and we were all anticipating exactly what would transpire. Let's see what transpires in the next one. Part 5 of the FHOA story. The open board meeting. The board, the new management company that they just hired to enforce all of the fines that they planned on sending out, that they hired without our knowledge, and the HOA attorney, they also had a cop there as well, were all there in addition to at least 25 homeowners. As unhappy as the majority of the homeowners in attendance were, they were overall pretty respectful and reasonable. The board, their attorney and the management company on the other hand came off terribly. They were confrontational, arrogant, evasive, dismissive and right from the start clearly adopted an adversarial us versus them mentality. We really did not have to say very much because their own words and demeanor turned more people against them than anything that we could have said would. The first step towards removing the board is to have a petition signed by 25% of the homeowners calling for their removal, 25 people in our case. We already had the petitions prepared and in the hallway after the meeting we had furious people lining up and jostling for position to sign it. There were people in attendance who have never been to a board meeting in the 20 to 30 years that they have lived here, who showed up completely outraged by what has been transpiring. Of the 5 board members, one of our neighbors was the only nice and reasonable one. One of our friends pulled her aside after the meeting and asked her if she was in agreement with what was going on, and she said, "No, I'm not any happier about this than you are." Our friend asked her why she was even on the board if she did not have the spine to voice her opinion, and if she was just going to vote whichever way that she was told to by Mac5, she may as well just resign. One of the homeowners does the bookkeeping, gets paid $6,000 a year for it too. He showed up late from work, was visibly angry, asked a few questions, was blown off by the board and stormed out. My wife caught him outside and he was the first to sign the petition for their removal. Off the top of my head, of the 25 residents in attendance, we obtained 22 signatures, not counting the board of course. The problem was that we knew for a fact that they would try to rig the election by stuffing the ballot box, making ballots disappear, try to schedule the meetings and subsequent election on a holiday to try to prevent us from getting the 20 attendees needed for a quorum, for the removal of the board, etc. To show you how out of control this is, the state law is that you have 21 days to contact the board to appeal a violation notice. They changed it to 5 days from the date of the violation. You actually have 5 days to contact them by certified mail minus however long it took you to get the violation letter, so basically they have all but eliminated the appeal process. It would seem to me that even if you were legitimately in violation of something, if they refused you a hearing because it took you 7 days to contact them, that they would be in violation of the state law and that you could get off on a technicality. They could not or would not give a straight answer to anything. The lawyer frequently got up and pontificated at length, deflecting the question by droning on and on about something else. When asked about the questionable 5-day appeal process or asked direct questions about the ludicrous new use restrictions and how they were going to enforce them, they gave vague, wishy-washy answers like,
"Well, we will consider it case by case. It's a living document subject to amending at any given time. We cannot answer that, we will have to play it by ear."
In other words, we are just going to make it up as we go. Days after the meeting, when they found out that a petition was being circulated, they released another of their infamous newsletters, which previously had been used as a sounding board by them to personally attack us for 9 months straight. It quickly degenerated into a 5-page hysterical rant as they became more and more unhinged, which only confirmed everything that we had been telling people for the previous 9 months. They carried on about how every board before they took over was derelict and incompetent, the community was spiraling into the toilet, and they heroically wrote in and saved the day for us all. How this community survived for over 30 years without them, we will never know. Our attorney described it as sanctimonious. They also featured my wife and I in another of their near-monthly personal attacks, essentially painting us out as absentee owners who have literally not done any maintenance to the property in a decade. Of course, none of these allegations have any basis in reality. Things ran far better under the previous boards, and we personally put in a good $50,000 into improvements to the property since we owned it and had never paid a single penny in fines in 20 years of living in an HOA. The only reason that we did not file a civil suit for defamation and harassment, as it would have been counterproductive to do so at that time, as the main goal was getting them removed. We eventually ended up getting 55 signatures out of 99 houses, and which is well over the minimum 25 that we needed. The one reasonable board member that we knew resigned over the whole situation. The homeowner who has been doing the bookkeeping resigned, and the management company that they hired wanted out too. One of our friends called the management company and they told her that they did not feel that the board had been honest with them, and when they saw that a large percentage of the homeowners were furious with the board, they wanted out. The board was required by law to schedule a meeting where we would be voting to determine on whether or not the remaining 4 board members would be removed or not. The board took a business as usual position and just stuck their heads in the sand, trying to act as if nothing was going on. We anticipated that they would try to push the meeting and vote out as long as possible and hope that things cool down, people go out of town for the summer, etc., and that maybe they can manage to avoid being removed if apathy sets in and people won't show up to the meeting or bother to vote. We also knew that this was really only a short-term solution that basically just kicked the problem down the road for someone else to deal with later. Once things settle down, inevitably homeowner complacency and apathy sets in. People don't go to the meetings, they don't vote in board elections, won't run for the board, and eventually the same idiots will get back on the board the same way that they got on in the first place. They will run uncontested, but in the short term we still lived there, and just trying to sell our house with those new rules in effect would make it more difficult. Early on, our attorney tried to reason with the board and their attorney, and they basically told us to go F off and challenged us to take them to court, not considering that we could just go to the recall route and get them all removed. I did a search on the attorney that the board was using and found at least 4 articles where she had represented an HOA board against a lawsuit by the homeowners, so this is just what she does. After it all hit the fan, she lied to her boss in an email that I saw, trying to cover her tracks, and claimed that she was not kept informed of what the old board had been up to. The problem is that we had her on tape at one of the meetings, preaching at length, basically telling us and the board that this was a dictatorship and that they had the power to just make up whatever they wanted and there was not anything that we could do about it. How wrong they later found out they were. They are lucky that it did not end up in court. We had concrete proof of the attorney's lies and of the board committing fraud and falsified meeting minutes and election results. And they knew that I knew all of the above, and they also knew that we were not going to go back down or go away, so they really had no other option than to follow through with the recall election. And now we're gonna look at part 6 of the Mac 5 story. In the weeks leading up to the recall election, they released a few more of their notorious newsletters, the last of which was a 4-page tirade filled with the usual personal attacks that I had come to expect on a monthly basis now, along with fear-based attempts to scare people into not removing them by claiming that the community would spiral into the toilet without them to lead us. It was filled with so many half-truths, things taken out of context, and outright lies that it would take an hour to try to address it all. They were also making highly inflated claims of the legal costs that they claimed that we were causing them to incur. They did, however, rack up $6,000 in legal fees creating all of the new rules, and then rolled up another $4,000 plus in legal fees, fighting tooth and nail not to get thrown out. Later on, after Mac 5 was removed, he caused the HOA to incur an additional $2,000 in legal fees because he kept sending threatening letters to the new board members' houses, the management company, the HOA attorney, putting up a website, sending out flyers to the whole community, with pictures of all of the things that he did not like, etc. They were doing exactly what I expected of them, reacting like children having a tantrum. They decided to go out kicking and screaming, racking up bills that the budget could not afford, all to pursue their personal agenda and to maintain their position on the board at any and all costs. They never showed up to the recall election, and the attorney and staff ran things. As expected, they tried to rig the election with bogus mail-in ballots. It was not too hard to figure out about a half dozen or so snowbirds, absentee owners, etc. who are almost certainly out of town and not likely to show up or to vote. We also knew that it would not do them any good. In the end, it did not matter. The 4 of them lost by a landslide and were all removed. An election was scheduled to appoint a new board. The conclusion of the meeting was pretty funny because I happened to be standing by the exit door and everyone wanted to shake my hand on the way out like it was a receiving line. At least a half a dozen people came up afterwards and said that they wanted to personally thank me for all of the time and hard work that I put in to get this done, which I appreciated. We anticipated that the now former board members would still try to find some way that they could contest the results, but they never did, as they had no legal basis on which they could. A new board was elected after the recall. Mac 5 attempted to run even though he was just thrown out and was not eligible. To add insult to injury, my wife got elected, and by accident or design she had the honor at the next board meeting of detailing to everyone how all of the crazy rules that the old board dreamed up had been removed. Among the many things wrong with what they did, the old board essentially committed fraud with the paperwork that had been filed. At the first meeting of the new board, the new HOA attorney stated that it was
virtually unheard of for 2 people to get an entire board removed,
and
that it must have been a lot of work.
No shit, it cost us around $5,000 in legal fees, and at times I was devoting 25 to 30 hours a week on it. In the following months, Mac5 seemed to become more and more unhinged. He started sending threatening and harassing letters to the board members' homes, the management company, and the HOA attorney. The attorney dealt with him, but when he did not get what he wanted, his crazy rules reinstated, he completely lost it. He and his wife started regularly patrolling the neighborhood, clipboards and cameras in hand. We still had not sold our old house yet, and at one point our agent got a call from an agent that had just tried to show the house. Apparently, Mac5 confronted them and the potential buyers in our driveway, telling them,
"If you buy this house, you had better maintain it the way I like. The previous owners have been warned repeatedly, and now so have you."
Needless to say, it did not give the buyers the best impression of the neighborhood. I had to email him and told him that if I got another call that the agents and buyers were being harassed, that I would call our attorney and have a restraining order taken out against him, and that seemed to put an end to it. Everyone was wondering what he was up to, but for the most part just ignored him. A few months later, he was at it again, this time sending out a multi-page tirade filled with wild claims, conspiracy theories concerning the new board. He, demanding that his rules be put back into place, claimed that he had been defamed and was now expecting an apology, posted pictures of all of the houses that they did not approve of, claimed that the whole place was spiraling down the toilet since they were removed and was on the verge of becoming a ghetto, and that only by reinstating his rules and the old board would they be able to bring it back from the abyss. In addition, he also claimed that every previous board was derelict in their duties and only he and his minions knew what was best for the community. He went so far as to put up a website dedicated to his insanity. It looked a bit like the old TimeCube website, all different types of fonts of various colors and sizes. Mac5 was strutting around the neighborhood extraordinarily pleased with himself, as if he had actually accomplished something significant. The rest of the neighborhood was not so impressed or pleased with it all, particularly the homeowners whose houses were photographed and featured in his newsletter and website. To illustrate the level of dishonesty going on, one of the residents had a flat tire and had jacked up the car to put the spare one on. Mac5 photographed the car on the jack and featured it to try to make it look as if it had been that way for months. The next board meeting was coming up, and I think that he had the idea that he was going to turn the community against the new board, but what he got was a room full of angry people who specifically showed up so that they could yell at him. Another of the former board members almost got into a fight at the end of the meeting with one of the other homeowners. For his part, Mac5 slunk out at the end of the meeting, getting cursed at by some of the residents as he left. His website was not up for very long because the dummy posted videos that he had taken of the last few board meetings online without permission, so we were able to get his domain name taken away. But you apparently cannot keep a good cook down, because Mac5 was undeterred and he and one of his minions ran for the board again at the next election. Out of 30 votes cast, he and his puppet only received 3 votes. He pretty much dug his own grave with that last newsletter and the website. What little support that he may have had was now gone, and he and his wife were officially the pariahs of the neighborhood. At the end of the meeting, he got up with a prepared statement that he had copies of for anyone who wanted it. My wife had had enough and was not going to be subjected to any more of this nuts rambling, so she just got up and said, "That's it, I'm officially done with this," and walked out since her duties as secretary were over. Of course, I don't doubt that he will try again next year, but it is no longer our problem since we finally did sell our old house. And now we are gonna take a look at part number 7, which is titled Mac5 shows that you cannot keep a good cook down. Needless to say, my experiences living in HOAs were not positive ones. Board positions are a magnet for every little would-be dictator to live out their fantasies, to abuse their power. HOAs also seem to bring out the worst in human nature. I think that the way my wife described it was petty judgmental bickering. In our case, the board's attitude was,
only we know what is best for the community. You people are too stupid to know what's good for you. Just give us your money, shut the F up, and do as you are told.
They convince themselves that they are in the right, and so, like religious zealots, any action is justifiable, because to them the ends justify the means. The nexus of all the issues came down to Mech 5. His minions were incapable of really accomplishing anything on their own and simply just followed his directives. The guy genuinely has something wrong with him mentally. He goes through life bullying, blustering, conning and intimidating people into doing what he wants. He goes around with an arrogant air of superiority as if he knows it all and is the smartest person in the room, when the reality is he may well be the dumbest. But he's able to con a lot of people because they think,
he seems pretty confident and acts like he really knows what he's doing.
If you call him out and stand up to him, he has no answer because he really does not know what he's doing and does not understand what you are saying. When I quoted the bylaws, CC&Rs and state statutes, pointing out that what he was doing was invalid, he just shut down and his answer was,
this is not up for discussion.
In other words, why can't you just shut up and do what I say like everyone else does? He is so arrogant and out of control that at one point he was actually trying to argue HOA law with the HOA attorney. Once he got booted from the board and he lost his power base, watching him have a meltdown was like watching someone with OCD who cannot perform their rituals. The guy seemed to totally lose it. It had nothing to do with doing what is best for the community. Ultimately, it was all about feeding their egos, abusing their power and controlling, dominating and micromanaging the lives and the property of everyone in the community. This guy and his minions will continue to be a nuisance for everyone living there for years to come. Once we moved, I figured that was the last that I would hear about the old HOA. Well, 6 months later, I got an email from one of our old neighbors. He wanted the name of the HOA attorney that we had to hire to help us oust the old board before we moved. Apparently, according to him, the new board was now slowly starting to resemble the old one. New rules, new fines, selective enforcement, holding meetings with the minimum of notice to the community in the hope that no one will show up, creatively manipulating the rules to serve their own personal agenda, etc. He feels that it is going to blow up again and eventually end up in court, so he figures that he better get in touch with an attorney sooner rather than later. This current situation does not surprise me at all and was part of the reason that we moved. I was concerned that once a new board took control, that eventually down the road it was just going to be more of the same. I was already beginning to hear rumors and grumblings of discontent just before we sold. I'm convinced that some of these people will never be happy with any board that is elected over there. The only board that they would be happy with is the one that they are president of, and even then they would complain about all of the work that they had to do. New people get on the board, they've each got their own agendas, personal grudges, pet peeves, etc. They let the position go to their heads, and before long they set about fixing things and want to rule over the community with an iron fist because a dictatorship is okay as long as you are the one in control. The more things change, the more they stay the same in HOA land. It is a broken system, a failed experiment and further confirmation of the Petri dish principle, which I posted about earlier. If years ago I knew what I know now about HOAs, I never would have bought a house in one. FHOAs never again. Edit: after I wrote all of the above, but just before I had the chance to post it, just yesterday I heard from some of our old neighbors. Apparently, Mech 5, frustrated at the fact that he and any of his minions have been unable to get back on the board, has just put his protest website back up, but at least this time he was smart enough to be a bit more low-key than the off-the-wall lunacy that he had up before. And with this we have reached the end of the video. I know that not everybody likes r/JustNoHOA, but I hope you can still appreciate this mega XXL saga video. If you are not subscribed yet, I would really appreciate if you could click subscribe and also click the bell button to never miss any of my uploads. I hope you have a fantastic day and I see you again tomorrow.